Thank you. And well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the sponsors who made it possible for me to be here and give this talk. And so today's topic is what's new in LuaRocks. I'm going to start by presenting LuaRocks because I will not assume that everyone is familiar with it. So and then after presenting the tool, I will start talking about really what's new in it and what has changed since perhaps the last year's workshop, where I gave a talk on the history of the tool and its future ideas. So, well, for starters, what's new? There's a new logo, and that's the first thing that's new about LuaRocks. But let's start from the beginning. So, what is LuaRocks? Well, Lua is very popular as an embedded language, as an extension language, which you put into your application, so making scripting with it and things like that. But lots of people love Lua and would like to use it for other kinds of applications as an application language and following a different kind of development style, the kind of thing that we call like programming in the large, this kind of thing. So for that, you need an ecosystem of lots of modules and extensions, and to add functionality, to add like the missing batteries, because the language is so small and compact, and you need lots of additional libraries. So for that, you need a package manager. So it's a package manager like all the other ones that we are used to, well, for Lua. And by Lua modules, I mean not only, of course, modules written in Lua, but also modules written in, say, C, C++, things like that, the things that we call binary modules. So what does it do? Well, all the things that you expect that a package manager would do, which is to install the programs and make sure that it is going to find it when you try to require the file, remove and make sure that things don't blow up because you now remove the critical parts of your dependencies. So you have to check the dependencies. And also, one thing that LuaRocks also does is actually compile C code, because Lua modules may be written in C, and we have to have a cross-platform way for compiling them. So LuaRocks actually doubles as both a package manager and a build tool. Well, how does the LuaRocks ecosystem work? So we have, on one hand, we have command line tools, which is like the LuaRocks command, which you type from your command line. To have packages, you need to have a specification format file, which we call the rockspec files. Once you take the rockspec files and package them, you get a package, which is what we call a rock file. And where do you put those rock files? Well, you have to put it in a rock server, which is our way to serve the package modules over the internet or even locally, so you can have your rocks installed. So let's take a quick look at each one of those. So how to get started in the Lua ecosystem? Well, there you go, up and running in one slide. Okay, from a bare machine, you just this would work on, say, a Linux or a Mac. So go there, get Lua, unpack it, compile it, you got it installed. Then go there, LuaRocks, get the latest version, unpack it, configure, make bootstrap. There you go. Now you have both Lua and LuaRocks installed. So now you can just write something like LuaRocks install Lua socket or LPEG or Lua file system or any other popular Lua modules, and there you go. Then you run Lua. You can just require whatever module you need, and you can actually just grab the PDF file from this presentation later on and actually copy those commands, and they will actually work. So lots of people get into the mailing list and ask, oh, how do I get started in using Lua and things like that, and people point us various directions. Well, here I am pointing to yet another direction, but a very simple one. You know? Of course, if you're using, say, a Debian-based distribution, Ubuntu, something like that, you can just apt-get Lua, and things vary a bit. We also have a Windows package that does roughly the same, but it's actually nowadays it's not that hard to get into Lua and use it as an application oriented language. The rockspec file, well, we are basically coders here, so I think people like to see actual code examples. So instead of lots of bullets explaining the rockspec file, I thought I would just show you a quick example. So the rockspec format is actually a Lua file, which has Lua tables describing it. So here's an example of a MIDI control module, just so you guys can see the kind of stuff, the variety of stuff that we have nowadays in our library of rocks. And so we have some metadata. You can specify dependencies. You can actually specify external dependencies on other C libraries. So here's the ALSA, the sound library for Linux. And you have the build section. And here we have a declarative way of showing the modules that. So here, this module is a Lua file, but for this one, we'll have to compile this C file, we have to link this library and things like that. And this format actually is cross-platform. So if your C code actually compiles nicely, say on Linux, Mac, and Windows and things like that, you can just use LuaRocks to compile if any of those platforms, and it will actually use, say, the Visual Studio compiler or GCC or CLang. So then we move to the next one. And rocks. What's a rock? Well, it's a file. It's an archive file containing everything that you got compiled. And the file names follow this pattern. We have the package name, the version, the rock revision. So for Lua file system 150, you would have a file like that. And the type, which can actually be a source rock, which contains the source code. You can actually pass that rock to the LuaRocks command line tool. It's going to compile it and generate a binary one. For example, here would be like LPEG compiled for Windows. You can have that package. And some of the rocks actually only contain Lua code, so they're actually portable. You don't have to compile it, and you can actually install it anywhere. So we call them all, like for the platform identifier. In the end, it's just a zip file with standard contents. So we have some standard subdirectories, and then a rock manifest file that lists everything that's inside. So for control and checking and checksum and things like that. Well, we basically never manipulate the rock files, the insides of them directly, because the command line tools does all that stuff for us. Finally, I think I have it's a little cut down there, but no, yeah, now you can see the whole thing. Yeah, that was my last example. The rock server. The rock server is just a URL, okay, so containing your rock files plus a manifest index file. The LuaRocks command line tool, when you use, like, here's cut, but you have that --from or --server is the same thing. You can specify any repository. It doesn't have to be the official one. So if you have your own repository, just get a web server up, put your rocks in there, and use the LuaRocks admin command tool to generate a manifest file for your directory, and you have your own rock server. This is very useful for, say, private in-house server for your company, specialized rocks for your own application, and things like that. So we just generate that with make manifest, and then put it online, and you can use it. And you can use any rock server in various ways. It can even be a local directory. I put those examples here in the slides because lots of people, I realize in the mailing lists that lots of people don't actually know don't actually realize the flexibility of the tool, in which you can actually just do things like this. You don't actually need a server. You can just get a rock spec and pass it to install, and it's going to compile and install it. Or you can actually pass a whole URL for a rock spec or a rock file, and LuaRocks will get it and install it. And so the arguments are pretty flexible in that sense. So now that we covered our 4 major sections here, we're pretty much introduced to LuaRocks, and we all know about what we're talking about now. So we get to the point that we're going to start talking about what's new in LuaRocks. So to talk about what's new related to what, let's take a quick look back at last year's talk. which was called LuaRocks Past, Present, and Futures, in which it had 3 parts, in which in the first one I told the history of the tool, and then I told where we were, and part 3 was called the future. And the things that I talked about last year in the future, so, well, last year's future, well, it's either this year's past, or now, or maybe next year. So let's see what was the future I was talking about, and let's compare it to what actually happened. So the future I talked about was this. I started talking about the future of the ROCK server. I talked about curation and scalability, because at that point last year, as I told you that the ROCK server was a very simple, just a URL, a directory packed with rocks, and it was just a web server that I maintained, and people would send me rocks over the mailing list. I would take them, I would take a look at them and say, oh, looks good, and I would upload them personally to the ROCK server, which was the default one that comes pre-configured with the LuaRocks tool. So that was, in essence, a process of curation. So sometimes people would send me a rock spec containing like an obvious error, and I would reply to them on the mailing list and explain what was wrong, and they would fix it. So there was this little bit of quality assurance process in that. But that was a scalability problem, because sometimes I would take days off, or I would get sick, or I would go on holiday, or I have like stuff in the university to do, and I would spend like a week without looking at the email. And people would want to get the rock in the repository. So that was not a very good situation. Early on, from the very beginning, because when we didn't have a lot of rocks, and the tool was basically new for everyone, so people needed a lot of help to get their rocks and rock specs right. So that curation process in the beginning was very important. So I was like hand-holding, all the early users and helping them get into LuaRocks. But nowadays, there's lots of documentation and lots of people sending rocks like almost every day or something like that. Scalability became a real problem. So last year, I was talking about, well, what can we do to fix that? The other things we talked about, last year's workshop in Toulouse, there was quite a few talks about this whole thing of the Lua ecosystem and Lua for programming in the large and things like that. So there's LuaRocks project, there's the LuaDist project, which is another approach for packaging Lua modules. There was the Lua for Windows project and things like that, and we talked about a lot there about how to cooperate and how to get these things in a more unified direction. And that included improving the interplay with distros, because sometimes people say, no, I just want to use apt-get and install things via my own package manager, say apt or RPM and things like that. But one thing that I argued in last year's talks is that if you look at successful language-oriented package managers, say like NPM for Node.js or Ruby gems, they had like tens of thousands of packages, which are a way larger number than the actual packages that Lua Linux distribution has. So you cannot expect to have everything packaged through RPM or apt and things like that. So there's a place for language package managers there. And we discussed also further development, like more extensibility, LuaRocks as a library, and things like that. So let's see how that went from last year until now. So, well, first part of that future would be this year. Let's see what happened this year. This year we had two big releases. LuaRocks 2.1.2 in the beginning of the year, and that introduced the LuaRocks doc command, which I'm going to talk about. It has lots of improvements on Windows, and it was very nice last year to meet in person Thij Stryer from the Netherlands and Ignacio Burgueño from Uruguay, who are also LuaRocks developers, and who they do like lots of the heavy lifting work to get LuaRocks working nicely on Windows. So shout out to you guys when you get to see the video. And well, it's mostly like improving the installer, lots of bug fixes, and I'm not even a specialist in this part, so I'm gonna skip this part, and maybe next year the guys will come to the workshop and give a talk only on LuaRocks for Windows. And we also added like this Rocks provided field to the config file, so you can preload dependencies, and that has some interesting implications. Later in the year, we had LuaRocks 2.2, which added preliminary support for Lua 5.3. That means, well, we actually took like the work or the alpha version, the version that was available, and we tested with it, and we did like, I think it was very minor changes. Actually, we didn't have to, and that's an important thing to talk about since we are talking Lua 5.3. We didn't have to change anything in our code to get LuaRocks to work in Lua 5.3. We always wrote the code to make sure that it runs on Lua 5.1 and 5.2, and everything just worked fine with 5.3. The changes that we have to do to add support to 5.3 was actually to make it detect like 5.3 as a version and create like a user/lib/LuaRocks/rocks 5.3 and things like that. So you can like pass 5.3 as a version option in the configure script and things like that. So the code would actually work for 5.3 out of the box, but it's packaged rocks for 5.2. So those were the small changes that we had to do. So I was really happy when the first time that I got a Lua 5.3 tarball, compiled it on my machine, and I ran the whole LuaRocks test suite, and it worked. Then the other two related and very major changes was that in LuaRocks 2.2, we actually added an upload command so that people could just type in LuaRocks Upload and pass their rock spec, and they would upload that instead of having to email me. And how does that work, and why does that work? Because we have a new default rock server. So the major bullet from the future of that was something that we actually did this year. So that was a promise that we managed to keep. But let's go in parts. LuaRocks doc, documentation. Every programmer's favorite subject. There you go. Documentation for modules. It's important. We all want it. Nobody wants to write it. And we have an extra problem, because people would always ask, okay, how do I get documentation for modules? How do I get documentation for modules? Now that we have an easy way to get the module, people want an easy way to get the documentation. But like many other aspects of the Lua world, because Lua is such a language tailored for, oh no, just get it and put it into your application and have it live in your world, Lua adapts itself well to whatever world you have. And so it doesn't bring a lot of baggage of its own. So there's just no standards, because Lua philosophy has the whole mechanisms and not policies thing. So there's no policy for documentation. But if we were to have some kind of, if not a policy, but some kind of standard direction for that, well, something's better than nothing. So I wrote here. So I came up with some heuristics. I mean, okay, so there's no standard. So what do? Let's just go trying things out. So I wrote this little, like, very not pretentious LuaRocks doc command. What does it do? Well, it just goes out trying things. First of all, it looks, is there a doc directory in the package? Well, is there at least something called docs? Is there something that looks like a documentation directory? Well, if it finds, okay, so let's get whatever's in there. What's in there? Well, then it just goes like this weird pattern. Is there something called index in it? Is there something called README? Manual, perhaps? Is it like HTML, like Markdown, textile, TXT, something? No extension at all? Anything? And it goes like, okay, so I found like, okay, there's this file. Okay, so yours is documentation. Okay, so I grabbed the file, I put it inside the rock as a documentation, and if you type LuaRocks doc, I will try to show it to you. What do I mean by I will try to show it to you? Well, if it can be in any of those formats, then you're gonna have to need different programs to open it, and like I said, there's no standards. So what do? It's also different in each platform. In Linux, we have XTG Open, which is a standard free desktop thing to open various files of various kinds. In the Mac, we have the open command. In Windows, of course, we don't have anything. And but we try. So first try, well, we'll try the system browser command. Maybe we try to open it with the browser. No, I was being mean with Windows because they have a start command that actually does the same kind of thing. And if everything else fails, we just print out the file to standard output. And often, this is the best option, because you actually had a readme.md file in there, and you just print it out, and you get some documentation. At least the readme file will have an URL, something like that. And when everything else fails, I just print out the list of the files and say, I couldn't figure out which one was the documentation, but this is what the developer sent you. Yeah, a quick one for the ROCks provided thing, because it's a bit of a technical thing for LuaRocks users. It's a table in the configuration file where you can list ROCks that we don't actually have that installed, but pretend that they are installed, because in a sense they are. So this will give you, for example, if you're running Lua 5.2, it is as if you have the bit32 ROC pre-installed. What does that mean? You can specify bit32 in your dependencies, and if you can write code that runs in 5.1 and 5.2. LuaRocks on 5.1 will get bit32 from the ROC server, and if you're running 5.2, you already have that module built in, so you don't need to download anything. For LuaJIT, you have LuaBit up by default, and in Lua 5.3, we're going to have UTF-8, and the UTF-8 module can be compiled to run on Lua 5.2, so you can start writing code that uses UTF-8, and with LuaRocks, you can make that like an optional dependency. And since I had a bullet in last year's talk talking about interplay with distros, this could be something that could be evolved in a sense of interplay with distros, because then you could have, say, if you installed LuaSocket using RPM, maybe that RPM could put an entry in the ROCks provided configuration file, and then LuaRocks would know about it. But we haven't actually made movements in that direction yet. So the big change in the ecosystem, the big one, was that we now have a default ROC server, which is a nice website, which is MoonRocks. It was developed by Liv Corcoran. Shout out to him also. He's a developer of MoonScript, which is a language that compiles to Lua, kind of like CoffeeScript compiles to JavaScript. And so he wrote MoonScript, and he wrote Lapis, which is a web application framework using MoonScript. And using Lapis, he developed MoonRocks, which is a repository site. Anyone now can upload ROCks. It no longer go through the mailing list the way it used to go. So you can go there, sign up, create an account, link to your GitHub account, get your ROCks there. And you can also, that's a nice feature, you can actually, using that site, you can host your own server. Because by default, the ROCks will go to the standard, the default server. If the names don't clash, of course, you cannot go there and like take over my ROCks or something like that, or vice versa. But you can, anyone, just like their own forks in GitHub, you can have your own username, and you get your own manifest automatically. So, for example, if you wanted to install like my version of LuaSocket, you can go there and install it and just use, say, from that user. So you can get a non-standard one if you want. So ROCks you own, which means that like each ROC has an owner, and the logic is who gets that first gets the ROC, and all the ones that were in the old LuaRocks repository, we actually saving those names, and people are taking over the ROCks via their GitHub credentials or contacting us. So that was a big change, and now ROCks you own go directly into the manifest, immediately available for everyone. So we no longer have the curation, but things are much faster now in that sense. At the same time, you don't have to go through the website to upload your stuff, because now we have the LuaRocks Upload command. It uploads by default directly to MoonRocks. It uses the MoonRocks API, so it's not that obvious how to, it's not that automatic to get it like to work with your custom rock server, but it should be possible because but you would have to implement the MoonRocks API, of course. So now the procedure is go to MoonRocks, create an account, then go to settings in your account, and you can just click there and say generate an API key, and it will get you a blurb that looks something like this. And the first time you upload it and you give the API key, it's going to save it to a configuration file. You don't have to pass that every time. It will upload your rock spec. It will actually test your rock spec, the syntax of it, and then try to generate a source rock file. So it's going to package your, it's going to take the URL field from the rock spec that said, oh, my code's in GitHub and that repository. Well, it's going to clone your GitHub repository. It's going to pack it, make a source rock file, and then upload that. So if the website goes offline, well, MoonRocks is going to have a copy of your source code. So how did that change work for us? I don't have very precise numbers, but here's we can take a quick look of how things happened in the repository over the last year. So to compare, there's a 6-month gap on between each number here. So this is March 2013, 6 months, September, 6 months, March this year, 6 months, September, where we are now. So as you can see, the change to the MoonRocks repository was somewhere in between here, right? Between this one and this one. So, and this is before when we had the go through the mailing list and the whole manual procedure. And we had like this sort of stable growth, and we were going, and apparently things are starting to pick up a bit more steam now that the process is more direct. So about the whole change, I must say that I'm very, very happy with the result. And so what else has changed? And well, since we talked about the future last year, well, there's still more future to go, hopefully. One thing that I talked about last year, and one thing that we've been discussing for a long time in the mailing list, was the limitations of the rockspecs format, because it's a fixed format that's the same since LuaRocks 1.0, which was many years ago by now. And one thing that I tried in purpose to keep the format frozen, so people would trust the format, they would bother to learn it, and not because it's a new tool and every week the format changes and there's this new command here. I wanted people to learn the format and get to use it and rely on it, because when you decide, I'm going to ship my modules, well, I'm going to use this format, I'm going to use this build tool, and they have to rely on it and believe that, well, 2 years from now it's still going to build and still going to run. Well, the flip side is that the format has a lot of limitations, and things that we haven't foreseen it back in 1.0, people kept asking about it, and we couldn't change it because sorry, the format is frozen, maybe in the next major change. And I enumerated some of them here, and well, people who use LuaRocks a lot, they know what the limitations are. And last year, I was talking about, lots of us, we were talking about making this big redesign and say, okay, so now the time has come for us to, all of us sit together in a round table, discuss all the features that we need, and say, okay, so this is going to be like version 2.0 of the format or 3.0, and when we promise we're going to get it 100% right this time, and it's going to last for the next 10 years. And so I was thinking about a lot about this over this year. And what I decided basically is that instead of a big redesign and another freeze, it will be better to make it easier to go changing gradually. And so to do that, we will have to make it really extensible. So nowadays it's a little extensible, but it could be a lot better. So my plan, and this will be like the future part of the talk, and hopefully in the future talk we're gonna look back at it, is that we should have a concept of concept of add-ons, which means basically we have to modularize LuaRocks, and we have to let rockspecs specify which parts of it needs, and we have to make that version as well. So each subsection can evolve at its own pace. So the basic idea is to add a new kind of dependency that actually loads LuaRocks add-ons. Since we have the network, since we know how to fetch things from the server and do all things like that. So if a new rockspec needs a new feature, well, maybe the developer can implement that feature and have their own rockspec loaded. And to that, we'll have to have a standard way so that add-ons may add entries to the rockspec type checker, because we have a table that looks like basically a schema of the rockspec format, and we check that. So we have to have a standardized way so that add-ons can add new tables or new fields. And we have to have hooks in the build steps or the install steps or even the remove steps so that those add-ons can run and add functionality. For example, add test support or generate documentations and things like that. So the idea would be, let users guide the developers. Okay, so in other words, let's let other people do the work and not me. Leave me alone. Well, I have a PhD to finish, so for the next 2 years I'm going to be very busy. So it's better that if people develop the features they need instead of relying on me. So going a little bit more technical, the rough proposal is something like that. What I have in mind is that we could set a part of namespace, something like LuaRocks.addon.whatever. So you can just invent your own add-on, upload it to MoonRocks with that name, LuaRocks add-on something. And maybe we could have something like using, things like that. I thought about require, I thought about use, but those names have different meanings in other contexts. So we have to have something like a kind of dependency here that said which add-ons your rockspec is going to use. And then the first thing it's going to do is get from that list, check if you had the add-ons installed. If not, install them for you. And then run to the type checking of the rest of the rockspec. So for example, if I added support for build dependencies here, well, then I'm going to have this table available, which is not in the standard rockspec format. And if I added like a new extended build format here, well, now I can use it in the build section. And maybe that extended format allow me to specify that the language is actually C99, and that will give and that would pass the correct flags to the compiler. For example, it would say std C99 on Linux, and we'll try to perhaps compile it at C++ on Windows, which would make it closer to C99. Well, the last bullet of our future, our planned future, was LuaRocks as a library. This is something that it was my fault. I haven't foreseen this use earlier on, because the whole thing about start small, the minimum viable product, and things like that. I started with the minimum viable product, which was this small Lua script. It grew and grew and grew, and in the end, the problem is that nowadays we have stateful modules inside of it. We don't have actually that's what I mean by global state there. We don't have we don't pollute the global namespace like that. But we actually have stateful modules. So it's not fully reentrant for that. But to make LuaRocks embeddable into an application, so it could serve as, for example, as a plugin package manager. Have for example, applications that have plugins like Wireshark, which actually uses Lua, and things like that. Sometimes developers of these kinds of applications, they want to use LuaRocks embedded in their application, so they can have their own rock server for plugins and an easy way to install, remove, check dependencies, and things like that. But to make the thing fully reentrant and remove all state and modules and things like that, that would require major refactoring. And it was a project that I actually tried to start once, but it was a lot of work, because in a dynamically typed language in particular, to make sure that you have changed all the parameters in all of the possible code paths, and you didn't miss anything. And even with the best test suites and things like that, That would be like a ton more tests that I have to do and things like that. Major refactoring in a dynamically typed language is a lot of pain. But fortunately, and we're going to hear about it later in this workshop, thanks to the work by Andre, typed Lua is coming for the rescue. So my idea is to use typed Lua, which is going to give me static analysis checks to make sure that every parameter is in the right place as I move things around and remove state and create state objects and things like that. My idea is to use typed Lua in the process of refactoring LuaRocks to remove states from modules. So in the end, hopefully the result is that LuaRocks is going to be extensible and embeddable, just like Lua. And so it's funny, it's in a sense that how we started by trying to go away from, I would say, Lua philosophy and things like that, in that sense. That's, oh, okay, so let's extend the scope of the things people use Lua for by going, oh, let's think about application development, let's think about programming in the large. But in the end, we actually are coming closer to the idea, because in the end, people want to use Lua because it's Lua, and people want to extend it, and people want to embed it, and people want to use Lua the way Lua is meant to be used. So if we play well with that kind of behavior, well, then we're going to reach a lot more people and make the tool more useful as a whole. So I guess that was it for now, and I thank you, and I'm open for questions.
This is not really a question.
This is not a question. This is a complaint. Your code sucks.
No, this is a thank you.
Oh.
No, really. LuaRocks is one of my worries with my project, and the path you're taking now with extensibility is just perfect for me. I mean, I was like,
thank you.
I've been struggling with Ruby and with Rails to try to move things a little bit around so I could play nicely with the tools. And it's always been a horrible fight because different philosophies think, oh, we should do this like that or like this. And with your solution, basically, I can just build my own philosophy and have it work for everyone that needs my modules. And I mean, this is really great. It's just taking a huge lift out of my chest. Thanks. And thanks for your energy and, well, everything you do for.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I have one question about compatibility. Sometimes when some library is updated, it may break backward compatibility. And that's why we need to rely on some version of that library, but not higher. Ruby users have gems, which supports having multiple versions of libraries in the system. And does LuaRocks support that feature?
Yes, it does support that, and I know why Alexander is laughing, and that's an interesting story. Because LuaRocks actually started as part of the Kepler project in Brazil, and one of the requirements of that project was that we had to support multiple versions at the same time. So in the original releases of LuaRocks, we made that behavior the default. So you install version 1.0 of library X, and then you install version 2.0, and you have both at the same time. Well, how do you avoid conflicts? Well, then we had this special module that would take over Lua's require behavior to check dependencies and make sure that the right one was installed. And so that solved the problem, but it added complications to everyone else. People who just wanted it to behave like a normal package manager, in which, well, I installed a new version of the program. Well, I want to update it. I don't want to keep all the old ones forever. And people would ask, oh, why all these old versions are here all the time? And people would ask, why do I need a special require command just to load my modules and things like that? So in the end, there was much more a source of complaints than of praise. So we still have those features, but they are no longer the default. So if you have to have, specify an old version, then you can use in the dependency file and says, I need, say, Lua file system greater than 1.4, comma, less than 2.0. So that works. And when you install it, when you have the dependencies, it can install both versions at the same time if you have conflicting dependencies. You can keep both installed at the same time. The default behavior is not to keep, but you have like -- keep to keep it if you need. And we now have an optional package loader. So if you want to make your require super smart and check dependencies and make sure the right version is installed and not just take the latest one, you can require LuaRocks.loader, say like Lua -l LuaRocks loader, and require is now smart and knows dependencies and things work. So we actually have that feature, but it's no longer the default behavior because people just usually want the simple one. So another question?
Hisham, what do you think about sandbox environments like, bundler, RVM, and pip, virtual env? Do you see any value in this kind of thing which compartmentalize Lua's version?
Well, as a user myself, I am not a big fan, or I would say I'm not a user of these tools, because I think, in my personal view, most of this was created because those tools, like those other tools, like say RubyGems, things like that, they could not keep multiple versions at the same time. So the solution they got was to make compartments. But I see the value because it's a lot easier to manage, to have the separate environments. And I believe there is a Lua module for that. I think it's called, I think there are more than one. I remember that one was called Vert. And there are other ones that do that, and they work with the LuaRocks, and they create. And because LuaRocks has, just like I have like -- from to specify a different server, you can use -- to specify a separate directory, and you can have multiple trees, but local trees. This is a standard tool feature. By default, we have two trees, which is the user tree and the system tree. So if you run sudo LuaRocks install, it gets installed in the main tree. If you use it LuaRocks -- local, it gets installed only for your local user. But you can create other ones. If you just, I can make it in a demo here, but if you go like LuaRocks install lpag -- to user Hisham blah blah. Well, it's going to create a blah blah directory and make a rocks tree there, and all separate and all compartmentalized. So basically we almost have this kind of sandboxing feature by default, but there are some tools in the LuaRocks repository that automate the process even further.
Thank you for your presentation. I want to say that I was really surprised by the number of ways you are trying to find the documentation. There is a Perl language that is known for its motto. There is more than one way to do it. I want to say that Lua has beaten Perl in a number of ways. Different ways it tries to find the documentation. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. First one is simple. What happens when you find several files with the documentation? Do you open them all in a browser?
No, I have there's an order that which I don't remember, but I think like index.html is the first one, because if you have that, you probably have a nice HTML hyperlinked documentation. So if you have that, that's the first option. And then there's README, and then index manual README, something like that. But when it can't figure out which one, when it doesn't have an obvious contender, I'm gonna list all the available files, and then you just pick and open.
Okay, and the second question, I am not very much familiar with Lua, but just wanted to ask you whether it is a standard documentation viewer for Lua, and didn't you think about probably not forcing, but probably encouraging people to write the documentation in some standard format, so it would be easier for them to understand how to find it.
Yes, I have thought about that, and actually, one thing that I looked into was using LDoc, which is a kind of JavaDoc style documentation generator. For a long time, back then, 10 years ago in the Kepler project, we have a LuaRocks project, which defined a standard format for JavaDoc style comments. And the tool is now mostly dormant in maintenance mode, but LDoc is a new version developed by Steve Donovan, which uses the same format, and that's under heavy development. And so I thought about using that, and the thing that I considered was try to run LDoc and generate it, even if it generated kind of like empty documentation, just the name of the modules, and it will be better than nothing. And if people would see the generated HTML with the empty documentation, I thought that people would, get the push to go there and write LDoc style documentation. But at the same time, there's people who don't like LDoc and things like that. But it's a tricky thing to do because I can't just go there and start installing LDocs on everybody's machines. So I would like to see that kind of documentation become sort of a standard. And as you can, in one of my example slides, when I said when I put like add-ons, LDoc was one of them, and I would be something that I would really like to see an LDoc add-on. And I think whoever gets that first, the first add-ons and the first things that automate the generation of documentation, I think that would pick up traction. So I think this is the way that things more naturally happen in the Lua world. People, there's not lots of rules, and even in the whole thing that there's more than one way to do it, that sometimes in Lua it's like there's no way to do it, just do it yourself, So in the end, but in the end, people like to follow best practice. So if they see, all the cool guys are doing this way, I'm gonna do like this too. So I hope to see, a more standardized direction in there. I think we'll get there over time.
I believe the proper name of the paradigm here is "Leave Me Alone" development.
Yeah. You hear that a lot. Yeah.
Lua is famous for that.
Yeah, but
it works.
It works, and everyone's nice in the end. So the question that we were all waiting for a long time.
Actually, I have a few. First one is the follow-up on the question about compatibility and versions. How do you specify in the rock spec that, hey, this is a break-in version of?
Yeah, that's an important one. And that was almost undocumented for a long time, but we've always had an entry called rockspec format in the standard. And by default, it assumes that the rockspec format is 1.0, but from a long time, we already have support for that. So in the future, when we write, I think we have here, when we write rockspec format 3.0 in the future, even if you use a very old LuaRocks, it's going to say, you're using a new rock spec, please upgrade your LuaRocks. And now that LuaRocks can upgrade itself, we can say LuaRocks install LuaRocks. It's going to be not a big trouble for the user. It says, oh, your LuaRocks is too old. Oh, okay, I'll just upgrade it. Okay. And
I think we misunderstood. It was each other. It was a question about package compatibility, rock compatibility. So how do I say in my rock that it is incompatible with the previous version of a rock? So can I say, hey, 1.2 version of LuaSocket is incompatible with 1.1 version of LuaSocket, and LuaRocks would
you can add various in this dependency style, like this. For example, I need bin to C greater than 1.2. You can actually say like here, comma, and then put less than 2.0. And you can use all the operators and specify ranges. You can even say, complicated stuff like that. So you have, so you can specify compatibility in dependencies for rocks. So you can write a rock and say, I need a specific version of a dependency. There's no problem with that.
Okay, but in the rock spec for the exclusive incompatibility. When a Lua socket is not compatible with Lua socket, how do I do it? Can I do it? When 1.2 is not compatible with 1.1, so when I
No, yeah,
try to
but
upgrade-
you won't say that in the Lua socket rock spec. You will say that if I write another rock spec that needs Lua sockets, then that one either needs this version or that version.
But that would silently upgrade the Lua socket, because when I install that other rock and break some other packages that depend on Lua socket, older version of Lua socket.
No, that doesn't break because whenever I remove a package, I check all the dependencies. I check all the dependencies and I warn the user that something would break. So now that the default is not to keep, is actually whenever you install something, it installs and then removes the old one. So, okay, you wrote this package, it needs Lua socket 1, right? And then you upgrade your Lua socket to Lua socket 2. So LuaRocks will install Lua socket 2, no problem, and it will try to delete Lua socket 1. But before removing it, it checks to see if anyone else needs the old version. And then it says, warning, removing it would break a dependency.
Okay, thanks.
So
I get that. I had another question actually in stock. It was the question that I got when we discussed incompatibility. So the question I had is about MoonRocks as the rock hosting site. Why couldn't you just install rocks from GitHub or from any other Git source? Why would you need to upload your rocks, especially if these are just source rocks?
There are a few reasons. One of them is maintaining the manifest file for the repository. Well, first of all, we have a GitHub mirror, so actually you can point to GitHub and get the rocks from there. But there's good reasons for have our own server with the upload API and things like that. One of them is checking the ownership of rocks, and the other one is if we get more successful in the future, then scalability of the manifest file is going to be a problem, and we're going to need a specific API for downloading the rocks. The thing that we use now, this is the minimum viable product with the web server plus a manifest file. When we have 10,000 rocks, that won't be possible anymore. So we're going to need an API. So it's better to have things prepared now than to break in the future. So.
And finally,
I'm sorry,
out
the time.